This is part 2 of cells. And in this part, we're going to talk about the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So if we were to take all the cells in the world, we can divide them into 2 categories. We can divide them into either the prokaryotic category or the eukaryotic category. And it's really not difficult to do. They're quite different. And you will see that in this lesson. So I discussed before, there are 2 types of cells. There are what we call prokaryotic cells, and these are simpler cells that lack a true nucleus. Actually, pro means before, and karyote means nucleus. So these cells were around evolutionarily before a nucleus. So these cells lack a true nucleus, and they also don't have membrane-bound organelles. So any organelle that has a membrane around it, they're going to lack. So for instance, a mitochondria has a membrane around the mitochondria. It has a membrane. But a ribosome does not have a membrane around it. So therefore, whoops, I'll draw my little ribosome out here. A couple subunits of the ribosome. So ribosome does not have organelles around it, or does not have membrane around it, sorry. So they do have them. So prokaryotic cells lack these membrane-bound organelles. Also, then we have eukaryotic cells, and they're far more complex. They're going to have a lot more working components, and they contain a true nucleus. Eu actually means true, and karyote again means nucleus. So they have a true nucleus, and they also are going to have membrane-bound organelles. So if you think about the common cells, the animals, the plant cells with the mitochondria and stuff like that, those are going to be in the eukaryotic cells. So those are going to be the ones you're more familiar with. Prokaryotic cells you're going to be less familiar with. So let's go on. Let's talk about these 2 types of cells. So the first type is a prokaryotic cell. If we're looking for these, they're found in the kingdom Archaea bacteria. Archaea means ancient, so these are the ancient bacteria. And eu again means true, so these are the true bacteria that we're used to. So prokaryotic cells, in short, are bacteria. And if we're going to zoom in really close at a prokaryotic cell and look at it, this is what we'll see. You notice that on the outside of these cells, they do have a cell wall. So it's really important. Prokaryotic cells do have a cell wall. They also can have something called a capsule, which is sort of this other surrounding membrane, and we'll talk about that when we talk about bacteria. But they don't have, as you notice in here, they don't have a nucleus. Instead, they have just their DNA, and it's free-floating. And a lot of times it's a ring of DNA. So it's going to be a DNA ring that's all bunched up here. They also have a plasma membrane. So just like everything else, they have a cell membrane. That's right here. They have ribosomes. If you notice here, they have ribosomes. So they have these little structures that help make proteins. But they're free-floating. In ours, in eukaryotic cells, ribosomes a lot of times are attached to the endoplasmic reticulum. But in this one, they're not. They're free-floating around in the cytoplasm. Then they have cytoplasm, and a lot of times they have a flagellum. And they actually call it a bacterial flagellum because it looks a little different than our eukaryotic flagellum. But that's the story. So very simple. Has some DNA, has a cell wall and a cell membrane, and sometimes has a capsule around them, depending upon the type of bacteria. Has ribosomes, has a bacterial flagellum, some of them don't. But that's a prokaryotic cell, really simple. If we look at a eukaryotic cell is far more complex. And if we look down here, now I won't talk about all these things because we'll get to them, but it has a plasma membrane. It has organelles called mitochondria, which make energy. Prokaryotic cells don't have them. It has cytoskeleton fragments, so little pieces of skeleton. It's got endoplasmic reticulums down here. It's also got these weird things called Golgi vessels that are made of membranes. And once again, prokaryotic cells don't have any organelles made of membranes. It does have that nucleus, very important here. It has centrioles, it has cytoplasm again, has lysosomes. So in this, eukaryotic cells are going to have organelles. And an organelle is a small cellular organ. So down here, a definition, organelle is a cellular organ. And each organelle has its own job or function. For instance, the mitochondria makes energy. So this is what's going to turn glucose into energy, or at least turn the products of glucose into energy. Golgi vessels package stuff, and we'll talk about their job later. Lysosomes digest cellular products. So all these have their own function. They have their own job that they do within the cell. Okay, very good. Moving on. I want to talk about how this happened. Now, this is the goofiest picture I've ever seen, but let's talk about it. There's a theory in biology. So we started with a prokaryotic cell. We believe that this prokaryotic cell with this circle of DNA came first. So first we had prokaryotic. I'm going to write first here. This doesn't turn out very well on our right. So first, and then somehow that developed into these really complicated eukaryotic cells with a nucleus and mitochondria in it and endoplasmic reticulum and all this stuff. So somehow these simple prokaryotic cells became eukaryotic cells. Now we actually have a theory to discuss how this happened, and it's called the endosymbiotic theory. Symbiosis means living together, sort of in harmony. So if two things sort of help each other out, they have what's called a symbiotic relationship. And endo means inside. So here's what we think. At one time, there was a big cell. And that big cell was eating smaller cells, or engulfing it. Right? So it was eating, oops, my small cell disappeared. So it's eating these small cells over here. And then once it ate them, I'll draw big teeth over here. They don't actually have teeth, just an FYI. So this one eating this one, and it would digest it and break it down and use it for energy, just like animals do today. Well, what happened was we think that this thing ate one of them, but instead of digesting it down, it sort of let it live with inside of it. So instead of breaking it down, it lived inside of it. And therefore, it was able to make energy. So if this is a mitochondria, if this mitochondria was free living, it got ingested by this larger cell, and now the mitochondria lives within it, which means that new mitochondria can provide energy. It can give it energy. Also, that mitochondria doesn't have to go looking for food because this cell is going to go look for food for it. So the mitochondria gets something good out of this, and the bigger cell gets something good out of it. So they develop what's called a symbiotic relationship, where they learn to live together. So if we look down here, here's our very beginning prokaryotic cell, and it's got that nucleus, nuclear DNA. Well, we think that this sort of DNA got pinched off and pocketed within a nucleus. Okay, so that DNA got pocketed into a nucleus for protection. And then this cell went around ingesting mitochondria. Here's the mitochondria. So eventually, the mitochondria were living inside this cell with the new nucleus. And then the same thing happened. This thing started to ingest more organelles. And eventually, over time, it started to live with all these different organelles inside of it. And they would all live together and help each other out. That's called the endosymbiotic theory. Some of the proof for this is this. If mitochondria was once free living by its own, it would have to have DNA. Well, if we look at mitochondrial DNA, if we look at mitochondria, they do. They have their own DNA. So each of your mitochondria has its own DNA, and your cells have its own DNA in its nucleus. So why would mitochondria have its own DNA if mitochondria wasn't once its own living thing? So that's one of the big things. Also, we notice that when cells engulf things, they wrap them in a membrane. So if you notice here, it's sort of wrapped in a membrane. And if we look at mitochondria and chloroplasts, they have two sets of membranes. Two sets of membranes surrounding them. So they have a membrane, and then they have another membrane surrounding them. And we think that those two membranes, this outer membrane came from engulfing, and this was its original membrane. So that's another theory, and we'll talk about that more in class. That's another piece of evidence to support that. If you have any questions about prokaryotic, eukaryotic, or endosymbiotic theory class, feel free to ask me anytime. Make sure you're having a good understanding of these ideas. Have a good day.